Please give a warm welcome to Daniel Olson.
Did he take the clicker? Okay, thank you. Well, thanks, Bryce. Appreciate it. And it's good to be here because it's warm, actually. Relatively speaking, I was looking forward to coming down here, and I'm actually going to spend some time around tomorrow and visit Savannah. And one of the things that I do enjoy with my work is traveling and getting to places. And so looking forward to that. And then I was talking to a friend who lives just north of town here, and he sent me this message yesterday. And I hope he's over exaggerating, but I got off the plane here, and when I left this morning from by Green Bay, Wisconsin, it was 16 below, and I got off the plane, it was like 38. It felt pretty good, so we'll take it. But yeah, so we have a couple dairy farms in northeastern Wisconsin. Like you said, we've been there for a long time, lots of Olsons, and I have 10 little Olsons. Some of them aren't so little anymore. So we are hoping for an 8th generation. But one of the things that when we started Forage Innovations was this thought of pulling together the agronomy and the nutrition on dairy farms. And there was a lot of kind of, let's say, disconnect in the dairy industry, where we had people who were like really good at dairy nutrition, and then we had some that were, really good at agronomy, and they didn't always like understand each other, and they kind of knew what they both wanted, but they didn't know how to get it. And so what we try to do is pull that together, and coming from a dairy farm background, that's what a lot of dairy farmers have to do, right? Because you might have your agronomist or your nutritionist, and the dairy farmer is kind of stuck in the middle trying to make both of those people happy. And I see Larry Hawkins is here, and came up from Florida, huh? And that's somebody who I probably learned more about dairy nutrition than anybody else in the country, and I worked with Larry for years. But the thing that I think really jumped out at us when we were looking at this was, what is the thing that's the most challenging part of a forage system? And probably more than anything, the most challenging part is consistently growing enough digestible fiber to accomplish the things that the nutritionist wants to accomplish. Like, we can bring other things into a diet. We can bring starch into a diet. Of course, we can bring protein into a diet. We can do things, but digestible fiber is harder. And there's sources for that, but they're generally either inconsistent or they're expensive. We have more transportation involved, and the hardest thing to do is consistently grow it. And I'll be the first to admit that you guys down here have a harder time doing some of those things with the heat and your challenges in the summer than we do in the upper Midwest. So there's 3 main energy sources in a ration, and I guess you could also say fat or oil, but that's kind of a static amount that you can fit in. But the 3 things that are somewhat fluid is the amount of starch in the diet, the amount of sugar in the diet, the amount of digestible fiber in a diet. Now, a cow has an energy requirement, and you could have too much energy in a diet. But how you get there is kind of up to you. And there's pros and cons depending on each one of these. But we're going to talk primarily today about digestible fiber. And we're going to use the starch and the sugar as more of a prop to get us to where we need to be when we fall short. That's kind of how I like to approach that aspect of it. But first, I would like to talk about kind of how we identify it. Let's make sure we're kind of all on the same page when we're using this terminology. You probably all have seen feed tests and looked at them, and sometimes they're kind of confusing. For one thing, there's a whole bunch of numbers that add up to a whole bunch more than 100%. So we understand that a lot of those things are fractions of different numbers that are on the page. And then also we deal with a lot of different labs who have different layouts or different terminology. And so I'd like to just kind of talk through some of that. When I use terms like digestible fiber, what am I talking about? So first of all, we're just going to talk about NDF, and this generally would be classified as NDF OM, or there's some other factions depending on what, or terminology depending what lab you're using. Let's go back. There is the NDFD 30. And there again, some labs are using a little different assays and stuff, but for the most part, NDFD 30 is an industry standard number. That is the percentage of the NDF that's digested in 30 hours of sitting in rumen fluid. Okay. There's the DNDF 30. That's the percentage of the NDF that's actually digested, or a percentage of the dry matter that's actually digestible fiber. And then there's the UNDF, that's the undigestible fiber in 240 hours. And I could throw this table in rumen fluid, and some of it's probably going to digest in 240 hours. That's a finite or infinite amount. So it's you hit that level, it's not going to get any more. But it's really important in giving us a baseline. And probably in all the years I've been involved in looking at things, UNDF 240 is one of the most consistent tools we have in predicting how a forage is going to feed. So just once again, what does it look like on a breakdown? So we have, of course, 100%. And of 100%, in this sample, 40% is fiber. That's the red line around the outside. So this is a sample that's 40% NDF. Now, part of that NDF is digestible. This sample here has a 60% digestibility, a 60% NDFD 30, which means that 24% of the dry matter of this sample is DNDF 30. And that's a really important number because this number right here has virtually the same amount of energy as starch or sugar. It can be interchanged with those in a ration. It's important to find that number. Then we also have, you could call this maybe potentially digestible fiber, and then we have a UNDF 240, the part that's never digestible. So here's a sample, and I'm just going to run through a couple of these pretty quick. And what we're going to do is we're going to do this DNDF 30 calculation because DNDF 30 does not show up on a feed test. And so what we're going to do is we're going to find our NDF. And in this sample, in this equation, okay, I'm just using the ANDF number, okay, which is right here. We have 41.7. That means that of every pound that we feed of this, 41.7% of it is fiber. There's some protein up here, 23% of it is protein, and there's some other there's ash that goes into that 100%, but 41% of it is fiber. Of that fiber, how much of it is digestible in 30 hours? And we're going to drop down and we're going to find this NDFD 30 number. In 30 hours, 44.8% of that is. So if those of you who have a calculator can do that number, you need that calculation. You're going to take 0.41 times 0.44, and you're going to end up with 18%. So of every pound of this alfalfa hay that we have here, 18% of it is digestible fiber. Can do another one. This one is a little lower protein. It's 20% protein. It has 43% fiber. I'm going to drop down. This NDFD 30 number is 75. This is some incredibly hot feed. Okay. And we can do the calculation. It's 33% of every pound of this that we feed is digestible fiber. Remember, like, what's a good corn silage starch level? Like mid-30s kind of, we're getting there. Here's another one. Once again, different lab, different looks a little different, but the numbers are basically the same. You're going to find your NDF. This is a really immature alfalfa sample. I'm guessing it's only 30% fiber, so made really young. And the digestibility of it is good for alfalfa. 57% of that is digestible. And you can look down here, if those of you who are used to looking at RFE or RFQ, this is by far the highest number of any of these three samples that we had. It's 245 RFQ. But look up here, we're still only at 17% digestible fiber. So even though the digestibility is good, the fiber pool itself wasn't very good, wasn't very large to start with. And so we only have 17% digestible fiber. Here's a millet sample. This is the last one, and I just wanted to bring this up for a couple of reasons. One, because it gives you something else to look at. This is a Cumberland Valley sample. And actually, Cumberland Valley does have DNDF 30 on it. And where you find it, so you can see it has the same thing. It has the NDF number here. It's 46.2%, because Cumberland has this percent of dry matter here. And so you can go down and do this calculation over here, but it also, that number shows up there. Okay, so in the Midwest, we have alfalfa. And you guys, we're not going to talk about alfalfa today because you just don't have a lot of it down through the South. But a very typical rotation in the Midwest is like 4 years corn, 4 years alfalfa, 4 years corn. And so what we've done in the Midwest is we like to change that up, and we start dropping annuals and other things in the middle between those years of corn. So instead of corn for 4 years and alfalfa, we'll do corn. We'll follow it with maybe triticale. We'll take that off the next spring, like a winter trit, and then we'll plant a summer annual or a cocktail mix. Then we come back with corn. And we've been able to increase yields dramatically in some farms using that kind of system. Now, when I've started working in the South and in other areas of the country, my first experience with Southern agriculture was actually Arizona, but I've since moved east and have dairies pretty much the whole way across. The first thing was to try to get up to speed agronomically, because you guys, the last thing you need is somebody to come in from 1,000 miles away and tell you to do something that you're pretty sure won't work, because we tried it already. But there has been some maybe new things or some advancements, and I'd like to talk about a few of those and the things that I'm excited about in the South. And then talk a little bit about how maybe some ideas just get you thinking about how could we include more of these in our cropping rotations. And the challenge when we get down in this part of the country is you do have a lot of variation in, I would say, your growing season or your climate. The difference from down south of Atlanta and into northern Florida and up versus to the northwest. There are pretty dramatic changes there when we move into different areas of Georgia and the southeast. And all of these things I think are going to work in some place, but some of that's going to have to be some localized, and you're going to have to kind of figure that out yourself. So one of the things I'm really excited about, and I've had quite a bit of success with, is BMR Pearl millet. So millet has been around forever. Definitely a warm season grass. And it gained some popularity after the sugarcane aphids came in. Now back, was it 10, 15 years ago now? It's probably been at least 10 years that the sugarcane aphids kind of started moving in from the Gulf. And that really made growing sorghum and sorghum sudan a lot more challenging down here. And it's sometimes almost impossible. But millet is naturally resistant to sugarcane aphids. And so there was a more of that getting included in it. And if, I think, beef farmers had been using it somewhat right along. The BMR gene, the brown midrib gene, is a huge improvement when it comes to quality. And especially when we're talking about dairy cows and managing our UNDF pool, anytime we can drop that down, it allows us to increase our forage inclusion rates. And the BMR gene is really important to help us do that. So BMR pearl millet, if you've seen regular millet, you haven't seen this, you'll notice right away, like much wider leaves. It's really kind of droopy. This is a multi-cut product generally. Although we are doing some experimenting, using it as a single cut product, kind of like you would sorghum as well. But once again, very high quality, low UNDF 240 number, and just a smaller fiber pool period. And it regrows really well in a multi-cut system. So we'll talk about kind of where we can include that in our rotations. BMR forage sorghum, like most of you guys have probably all planted forage sorghum of some degree at some time, and you are, and most of you have probably tried BMRs. There's two things that especially BMRs have issues with. And the first is standability, right? It's just a problem. It's not fun. You want to make a lot of people mad at you, send them out there after it all fell over and try to get that harvested. And you have, camper heads that are plugging and trucks that are burning their clutches out because they're plugging up and backing up. And it's not fun. The brachytic dwarf gene is really important when it comes to forage sorghums. The second thing I already talked about in the challenge with sorghums is that the sugarcane aphids moved in. And at this point, I don't know of any brachytic dwarf aphid tolerant genes, varieties that are on the market. Now there's one that's about a year away from getting ramped up. It's a dwarf, but it's more like 8 feet tall. So it's not a lot of you have probably used like 7401 from Advanta, which is maybe 6 feet. Everybody I think has that. This is going to be more like 8 feet tall, and that's about a year away. I know there's some production getting ramped up this summer on that. But I've seen it in some fields in Tennessee, Kentucky, Florida, and it looked really good. But that's a problem there. The photoperiod sensitive BMR sorghum Sudan, we've had a lot more, I would say, success with that recently. And largely because the aphid tolerant gene or resistant gene is a lot more prevalent and easier to get in the photoperiod sensitive sorghum Sudans. Now, there is a new variety, and that is on the market, at least for this year. I'm not sure who all is marketing that one yet, but if you send me a message, I might be able to get you connected. But there's a dwarf sterile variety that's going to accomplish everything we wanted a forage sorghum to do. It's a sorghum Sudan hybrid, but and this is another thing, when you hear about sorghum Sudan hybrids, it doesn't mean they're 50-50. It just means they got a little something of both. So there can be, it can be 87.5% forage sorghum, et cetera. And this one definitely trends towards that. And it's going to end up in that 6 to 8 foot tall range with all kinds of yield upside and quality. And that'll be a single cut product as well. It will throw a head, but it's male sterile, so it won't make a starch content. Annual ryegrass. Everybody's using annual ryegrass in the winter pretty much, right? There's all kinds of that down in the southeast, and there's been for a long time. But there's a few new things that I think you want to consider. Especially there's a couple new varieties coming out of Europe Eastern Europe. So this is a lot of the material that came out earlier was from more Western Europe. These are Eastern European varieties. So seed production in the Ukraine, in Romania, actually some stuff out of Bulgaria. So this is a little different climate. And of course, they're growing it through the summer. Here we're growing it in the winter. And what makes it unique is that, one, it matures really late. So annual ryegrass can be, especially that second year, it can be pretty heady if you want to keep it into the spring a little bit. And this is extremely late maturing material. And also, we're dealing with more tetraploid type stuff, which is going to have higher sugar contents, higher quality, and be more aggressive that way. We're not as concerned when we're growing through the winter, we're not as concerned about heat tolerance or drought tolerance. We're concerned about quality. And so maximizing that. Forage oats. I feel like there's maybe been a missed opportunity on some places with some of these newer oat genetics. And when you can take oats, look at this leaf. I mean, it's like 1.5 inches wide. And it's just incredible leaf mass on some of these newer forage oat varieties. And what we're doing with them is, of course, planting them in the fall and harvesting them then. We're getting a little more yield than we are out of the ryegrass. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But you do have a little larger fiber pool than you do with ryegrass, but the digestibilities can be really good. And really, anytime you take a cool season grass in the fall, the sugar levels are going to be really good because, well, grasses, they know winter's coming. And so they're wanting to take in carbohydrates, and they don't know you're going to cut them. So they're taking up carbohydrates. So what you'll notice in these cool seasons like this is that your sugar levels are going to be elevated. Your NDF is going to come down because they're trying to retain those. And then, of course, we go out and harvest them. Surprise, surprise. And then legumes in the fall, I think there's some opportunity to get some in. And I was visiting with somebody here before the meeting, and we were talking about, like, where do legumes fit in a ration? And they're certainly not a requirement. But when you look at these leaves here, what you see is this really fast pool digestibility. So as a whole, legumes have lower digestibility than grasses. And that's because you have a stem and you have leaves, okay? And those leaves make up the minority of the weight. They're very digestible, but they don't make up a very large percentage of it. And the stem is not very digestible at all. But that really fast fiber, there's something to be said for having some of that in a dairy ration. Now, you can find it through some other byproducts that can get close, but it's hard to replicate it. And so when I build forage systems, I like to see if I can find a place to bring some in. And down here, putting that in your cool season mix over winter would be the place to do it. So things like crimson clover, potentially, maybe even some red clovers will work in that situation. So here's just a couple ideas, and I'm not saying this is how you have to do it, but down here, most of you are, or a lot of you, are you double cropping corn? Like you're growing a corn crop, and then what, you're growing a second crop of corn after that, right, in the fall? Okay, I mean, that's pretty standard from here in south. I'm not sure, some of you to the north west of you probably aren't, but that would be a fairly standard process. And then maybe you're doing like let's go back. Like maybe you're doing like a ryegrass or something after that in the fall. But first crop corn down here can be pretty good. And there again, that's your farm, you know your numbers. I'm just going to throw stuff out there. But say we run 20-ton silage and 21, here we're at 7 tons of dry matter on that first crop corn. But that second crop corn can be challenging down here. It just, and it's been one of the more humbling things that I've been involved with, because I had some ideas of things that I could do. And man, August hits, it's just tough. Yeah, I didn't know I could grow that bad of corn. Like when I heard 4-ton dry matter, I'm like, man, that's bad. And yeah, I did some of that. It's just tough. And so we're doing some experimenting in Florida where we've been talking about, well, let's go to a really early maturing corn and slide that planting date. Let's just leave stuff open for a couple months and slide that and move that, to an early maturing. But we played around with different things. What I would like to do is to look at that BMR pearl millet following that in July. That crop can grow 2 tons of dry matter in 45, 50 days, pretty easy. And it can do another 2 tons, another 30 days after that of really good feed. Stuff that makes your nutritionist job a lot easier from a digestible fiber standpoint. And that's something that thrives on heat. And we grew it in Arizona where it hits 118 degrees and it handles the insect pressure. And I'm not saying it's going to be perfect with some of the disease issues you have down here, but it handles that kind of those pressures really well. And then I would like to follow it with a cocktail mix in the fall of forage oats, annual ryegrass, and maybe some legumes like crimson clover, maybe some red clover, something like that. If you're really concerned about pulling your UNDF pool down, or if you're doing grazing or things like that, we might be able to look at some other things, brassicas and stuff, but those can make harvested forages really challenging because of their moisture levels. But that fall forage oat crop will out yield ryegrass by quite a bit. And then we can turn around and harvest that again in the spring, and then we'll come back with corn again. And when we look at it from a digestible fiber, going back to the DNDF 30 calculation per acre, we can increase our digestible fiber per acre by about 1/3 in that scenario versus just a corn ryegrass rotation. Any questions on any of that so far? There's some clarifications, or somebody want to say I'm all off on something? Wouldn't it be the first time? Okay. Yeah, so when we talk percentage, weight, seeds per square foot or seeds per acre is a lot different than by weight. So we could talk 2 different things. But if I'm going to talk by weight, we're probably looking at 50 pounds of oats, maybe 15 pounds of ryegrass, and maybe 6 pounds of legume per acre, something like that. Now, on a seeds per square foot basis, that of course would be heavy to the ryegrass and the legume, but that would be a real typical rotation or mix. So on that slide there, still a lot of what we're growing is still corn silage. I'd like to talk just a little bit about increasing the digestibility of our corn silage. So I started this system, now it's probably 8 or 9 years ago now when I first started working on it. And I was sitting at a meeting one day with a seed company rep was up there. And they had just came out with a study looking at the population of corn silage in relation to the quality of it. And this guy was up there and he's like, and it was actually a pretty well done study. It was multiple locations, maybe even a couple of years of data put together. And they were anywhere from like 18,000 population up to 42,000 on, I want to say 4,000 increments. And one of the interesting things was, as the population went up, as you would expect, the yields went up to maybe 36,000, and it kind of plateaued. And as the population went up, the fiber digestibility went down. And there was a really clear correlation between these two things. And the speaker was up there and he said, and where those two things cross, that's where we want to plant our corn silage. And for them, it was 31,000 population. And I looked at this, the data, and, you know, looked over way on the one side of that graph at that 18,000 number, and the digestibilities that they were showing looked an awful lot like BMR corn. And there's a lot of areas in the country that you can't grow BMR corn. It just agronomically doesn't work. And even in the areas where it does work, there's always that kind of in the back of your mind, like, well, is it going to fall over? Are we going to, you know, if it doesn't rain for 6 weeks, are we going to get pollination? There's always that kind of challenge. And I looked at that and I'm like, oh, they just created BMR corn. So I spent a number of years doing some research, looking at plots, trying to figure out, first, why did that happen? Why were they able to manipulate the digestibility of the fiber by the population? And then two, can we repeat it? Can we maximize our quality and our yield at the same time? And how do we do that? So why does it work? So what I did is I went home, we started dissecting corn plants, looking at the fractions. And if you take this outside round on a corn stalk and you test the digestibility of that, it's about half of what the inside is. So if you want to use NDFD 30 as a metric of digestibility, this interior might be 70 or plus, and this outside might be 35, 32. It's pretty awful stuff. If you can turn a corn stalk from this into this, your ratio of undigestible material to digestible material changes. Okay, I'm just a dumb farmer from Wisconsin, okay? And even I could figure that out. All we're doing is manipulating ratios of taking the undigestible material and we're making less of it. Like, how many of you have used like upright silos? You know, you ever the difference between like a 12-foot upright silo and a 20-foot upright silo and the amount of capacity they have? And if you think of the concrete and the rebar that it takes to make them, or you think of a pit silo where you have a 40-foot wide versus 60-foot wide, and you just added 50% more capacity, but you didn't really add much more concrete. And that's kind of what we're trying to accomplish here. So we did it through stock expansion, and these are the results. Normally, conventional corn is about 8 points lower digestibility than a BMR. And we take that population back, we're able to gain about half of that back, about 4 points of that back. Our UNDF is almost the same as a BMR, and that's largely because our starch level comes up. Not only does the digestibility increase, but our starch levels comes up. And of course, the grain fraction of a corn silage doesn't have hardly any fiber at all. And our yields are up here versus a BMR. So not quite where the conventional was. This is an option for somebody who's like, who's nutritionist or whoever has been after them, like, hey, we need to increase our digestibility. We should be growing a BMR. We should grow, and you know you can't grow a BMR. Like, you just don't want to take on that stress and that agronomic hit. You know, this is an option. You think of You think of a regular conventional corn and you go to the BMR and all the things that get worse: standability, drought tolerance, starch levels, disease tolerance. You take that same corn and you pull its populations back, they all get better. It's more drought tolerant, it's more standability, better standability, less disease issues because you have more sunlight and airflow. Starch levels come up, more consistent ear set. This is one of my population studies, and it was pretty dry that summer. And this is the same variety here, planted at 24,000 and 34,000. And you could see here, it's firing. We got some stress going on here, and this same variety is thriving yet. And all we did was pull the population back. Uh-oh, there we go. Almost made it the whole way through without pushing the black button. So how do you get expansion? You do it through spacing primarily. That's your first thing. You do it through genetics. And not all hybrids will get stock expansion. They won't do it consistently anyway. And so that's one thing that I spent a lot of time at, looking at different hybrids from different companies, trying to find stuff that'll consistently respond to spacing. And then fertility, especially early fertility, is really important. I think a lot of the stock expansion is determined when that plant is young. That is my email and a website way up at the top. Any questions?
Back here.
Yeah, on row spacing. Have you done any research on row spacing and digestibility?
Yeah, so row spacing, it's kind of funny because I think lots of people have done studies on row spacing, right? And with a lot of different results. And so my thought is that some of it is variety specific, like some varieties respond to row spacing differently. And that has to do both on their ability for stalk expansion and also their leaf structure, how it's placed. So it's somewhat determined on the variety, whether it's going to respond versus, you're talking like 20-inch corn, 15-inch corn, 30-inch corn, or are you talking skip row stuff? Okay, 15 to 20. Okay, yeah. The one thing that I'm negative about it is when we move south, even through the southern Midwest and over here, is areas that have more humidity are prone to disease. I feel that narrow row corn is worse for that. And also just maintaining heat inside a canopy. So I'm pretty anti narrow row corn in Georgia. And probably right up in through to, say, Missouri. Now, when we get farther west, maybe in the Midwest, in the high plains, I think narrower corn is a really good thing. We're trying to maybe keep humidity in the canopy, and we don't have those disease pressures that we do. But down here, it has a way of just kind of blowing up. And so from a feed quality standpoint, I would say I'm anti-narrow row corn here. Make sense? Maybe.
Do you have, in your decreasing your plant population, is it kind of a linear curve based on your fiber digestion, or is there like a point of diminishing returns where you start seeing it plateau or flatten out?
Yeah, so I would say the fiber thing is pretty much linear. The yield thing definitely becomes a problem. Like there's a point where I don't feel like there's too much, you're giving up too much yield, and then it kind of drops off. And that number is different for everybody, but kind of my baseline when I've started working around the country has been like, okay, what's the optimal number for your farm agronomically, or for like maybe even thinking from a grain standpoint, like if you're going to plant an acre of grain corn, what do you think is the perfect amount for that? So what can your farm support? You know, do you have irrigation? What's your soil type, your fertility, your, you know, is that 30,000, is 34, is it 38? Like I have quite a few clients in Washington State now, and they're used to planting 40,000, 42 under irrigation out there. And so the numbers I recommend for them in the system are different than what I am on my farm in Wisconsin. So I usually take that number and then I slide it back, and I'm very comfortable moving like 6,000 to 8,000 back from that number. And in if the farm has some real goals about quality and is willing to give up yield, we'll pull it back even farther than that. So if 34,000 is your number, we're looking at 26 to 28 in this system.
Any other questions for Daniel? All right. Well, I know Daniel's going to be sticking around because everyone's going to be sticking around.
Yep.
Round of applause for Daniel Olson, everybody.